Hello and welcome to today's live stream, Rivers in Flux, Navigating Climate Change in the Connecticut River Watershed. My name is Amanda Major, and I'm the Outreach and Events Coordinator at Connecticut River Conservancy. I'm excited to have all of you joining us today. During this live stream, we'll hear an overview of the impacts of climate change on our watershed, develop our understanding of the fundamentals of river dynamics and floodplain management, and delve into current solutions that move us toward developing more resilient floodplains. We're delighted to have our four speakers joining us to share their expertise. I'll introduce them in a moment, and each speaker will pass their mic on to the next person. Before we get started, I'll share a few housekeeping reminders. Please keep your mic on mute during the presentations so that our speakers can be heard without distractions. We encourage your questions and ask you to type them into the chat box in the lower portion of your screen. We'll save time at the end to answer as many as possible. We're recording the episode and we'll post it by the end of the day on our YouTube channel. And finally, I'll be sending out an email later today with a link to the recording, PDFs of the presentations, along with some resources from the speakers. Next slide. All right, now I want to welcome our four speakers. Our first speaker will be Michael Simpson. Michael Simpson has been actively working, researching, and teaching in the watershed management and wetlands fields for over 40 years. He's a certified wetland scientist within the state of New Hampshire. He had been director of the Resource Management Graduate Degree Program at Antioch University, New England for 30 years, where he teaches graduate level courses in wetlands ecology, watershed science and management, environmental site assessment, and the principles of sustainable systems. Michael also co-developed, at the request of the Obama administration, the Center for Climate Preparedness and Community Resilience at Antioch University. He currently serves as a senior fellow in that center. Our second speaker will be Staci Pomeroy. Staci leads the physical science, mapping, and restoration section of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation Rivers Program. Staci became a river scientist with the Rivers Program in 2000. Her work with the Rivers Program involves facilitating community-based flood resiliency efforts, collecting stream geomorphic assessment data, assisting watershed groups with long-term river restoration projects, and providing technical assistance to those looking to work in and along Vermont's rivers. Finally, we have two of our excellent CRC staff members detailing how CRC is working on solutions that center restoration and resilience. First, we'll hear from Becky Budd, CRC's Restoration Program Manager. Becky joined CRC's staff in October 2021. She previously worked with American Rivers and the Nature Conservancy on land protection, river restoration, and conservation GIS projects. At CRC, Becky focuses her work on river restoration projects, which includes everything from removing obsolete dams, planting trees, and finding the funds and collaborators needed to do those projects. Supporting healthier rivers, floodplains, and forests throughout the Connecticut River watershed is what drives Becky's passion. After Becky, we'll hear from Lauren Zielinski, CRC's Stream Restoration Specialist. Lauren joined the CRC staff in July 2024. She's worked in river science, watershed management, and environmental flows since 2010 and collaborated on projects across the United States and Africa. She works on all aspects of stream restoration, from grant funding and project management to engineering and construction oversight. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. We're lucky to have these experts with us. Without further ado, I'll hand it right over to Michael Simpson.
Thank you, Amanda. Hello, everyone. Now, for my part of this presentation, I'm going to take a broader watershed view of the implications of climate change. But what also has to be considered is another major system shift, that is building out the watershed. I will conclude with some implications for CRC and the staff who are out there every day to maintain our watershed resilience. What is happening regarding changing climate in the past is probably a 45-minute presentation unto itself. But I like this proxy to drive home the point for the convening. The blues are floods and the white are other events, with the majority of those related to extreme storms and winter ice storms. You can see that the amount of money that's been spent on federally declared disasters has increased significantly in the more recent past. Now, another good proxy of change is from a watershed vulnerability study, which I conducted in eastern New Hampshire, which shows maximum flows in the Lamprey River are increasing at an increasing rate. Now, as far as the future, the projections of what will happen are just that. They're projections, they're not predictions. Now, the possible future is directly tied to the continued increase of loading of greenhouse gases. It should be pointed out that the more pessimistic future we are facing versus the more optimistic, you will see there's an increase in the divergence between those two over time. And the wider they get, the harder and more costly it will be to drop down to a more optimistic future track. And it should be pointed out that right now, based on more recent historic analysis, that we are on trend data analysis showing that we are currently on the most pessimistic future. Now, again, what is being projected for New England is, again, another hour discussion. But to summarize what we may see as definitive climate change trends in the next 20 to 30 years is temperatures will increase, average temperatures, and the winters will be seeing a greater increase in temperature. Average rainfall will increase, but statistics shows that once the average increase, the extreme precipitation events will increase to a greater extent, both in intensity and frequency. Ironically, droughts will increase in frequency and duration, and sea level rise is now unavoidable. Now, a simple way to understanding this may be to say there will be longer periods between precipitation events, but when it does rain, it will be more intense. Now, taking a watershed perspective of impacts to the main stems, climate is just one driver that influences the volume of runoff and the resultant height of a flood wave. The other is a changing landscape, with a focus on natural features such as vegetation coverage, soil type, and slope. Now, with this graphic, this is just a hypothetical impacted subwatershed in the Connecticut Rivershed. When the rain hits a watershed, the resultant flood waves come down the tributaries and converge at the main stem. And as I said, this is in an impacted watershed with land development occurring over both history and currently. The hydrograph for such a dynamic shows a rising limb of the flood wave, with the peak flow, the largest flood wave, reached by the time the water from the highest part of the watershed reaches the mouth. Now, this is countered by this hypothetical watershed, which we see in a healthy watershed are natural landscape features, which allows flows to sequentially reach the point of convergence with the main stem. Now, this is the hydrograph shows how natural features found in the watershed desynchronizes the flow. Now, the volume of water coming down the watershed is the same as shown in the previous hydrograph, but the duration is increased and the size of the flood waves are reduced. Thus, it is important to both maintain and restore natural attributes that mitigate runoff flow. And this is from one of my watershed assessment studies, and this instance was on the Oyster River in New Hampshire. The green is the current forested covered landscape, which unto itself desynchronizes runoff. But in order to prioritize what forested areas to protect, one might first focus on those areas of vegetated landscape that have soils that will allow maximum infiltration of water. And based on current available resources that are spent on the watershed, first steps may need to refine the focus to just those areas that are forested with permeable soils on steep slopes, which are here in red. Now, other landscape features that enhance flood desynchrony are wetlands, both because of their vegetation type and their ability of soils to soak up water. Also, on the main stem, as Staci will point out, is basically maintaining the floodplains, which are crucial to the waves that reach the main stem. And then there are the beavers, basically ecosystem engineers which create water impoundments, which also slow down the water. I might point out with the floodplain, I think Staci may know this, but the New England Army Corps of Engineers started in the 1970s a program called Natural Storage Flood Mitigation. And on the Charles River in Massachusetts, they basically bought up 8,000 acres to protect and preserve the floodplain. And they did that based on a cost-benefit analysis of maintaining a large Army Corps of Engineer flood control dam. Now, for human intervention to restore the flood storage capacity lost over time due to development, the rule of thumb is to desynchronize the runoff closest to the point of precipitation interception. This is why urban blue-green infrastructure is so important to develop on the watershed. Also, the high watershed approach that the former Soil Conservation Service, now the Natural Resource Conservation Service, was to develop dry basins and check dams high in the watershed. And this was opposed to the Army Corps of Engineers' primary approach, was to create larger flood control structures along the main stems, which now for the Connecticut River comprises 14 managed dams or 9 tributaries across the 4 Connecticut River states. But what shouldn't be used to desynchronize flood waves are culverts. They are not designed to be dams during high flow. Now, this culvert failure was on the Cold River tributary to the Connecticut. The result of this failure sent a flood wave 20 feet high down the valley at hundreds of miles an hour within 2 hours after precipitation began. It completely removed 2 houses, a general store in Alstead, New Hampshire, with many other structures with significant damage, as well as all the bridges and roads downstream required substantial repair, and it resulted in 2 deaths. This one culvert failure costs more than $20 million in infrastructure damage, and in many riparian areas, the areas were completely stripped of all vegetation and soils. Now, going from the current discussion of the headwaters of the Connecticut, it is important to mention future sea level rise. This is a visualization of average sea level rise impact to the lower reaches of the Connecticut River. will mean greater direct impacts from saltwater intrusion, but also further upstream impacts of where the tidal bore, due to the expanded zone of freshwater tidal systems, will create flooding up the river. But this doesn't take into account either the future maximum tides possible as well as storm surges, nor what would happen if both large flood waves came down the Connecticut while at the same time a storm surge or a high tide storm surge was coming up from the ocean. A glimpse of the scale of projected future impacts was seen with Superstorm Irene in 2011. The maximum precipitation was measured in Mendon, Vermont at 13 plus inches falling in 24 hours. The same amount of precipitation was recorded earlier during a more localized watershed-wide storm in southwest New Hampshire flood of 2005. These two amounts are in line with the most pessimistic precipitation future that my studies have modeled within New England. This can be translated based on historical data to be the 1,000-year storm event, or the probability of a 0.001% for that amount of rainfall occurring in any one year. But combine what happened in the upper watershed with what happened in the lower watershed, Connecticut's coast experienced storm surge 5 feet above normal tide levels, causing waves as high as 8 to 10 feet inland. Now, the increase in frequency of such intense low-pressure systems hitting the northeast New England coast, and locally we call these nor'easters, is projected to be as 40% greater within this century. But I want to be clear that Irene nor Sandy cannot specifically be attributed to climate change. At best, it could be characterized as an extreme weather event. But it has provided lessons of the scale of impacts that may occur from projected changes in New England's climate, and it definitely exposed deficiency in the resilience of both natural and human systems on the watershed. One final point: the most recent research about projected climate extremes does not take into account significant abrupt climate change dynamics that are showing signals of occurring. But again, this would just be another hour conversation. But this climate trend will be intertwined with the human response to climate impacts. Of the 44 million of the East Coast population, the Northeast is estimated that 67% of that population is potentially vulnerable to sea level rise. That may warrant a significant percentage of those retreating from those impacts. Now, this doesn't take into account climate migrations from the increasingly water-starved Southwest and the scorched forest states in the western and northwest part of the country. The Northeast states are one of the 4 areas designated that will probably receive a tremendous amount of in-migration of population in the next 10 to 20 years. What is clear in New England is that the population is increasing in peri-urban areas, which result in increased impermeable surface and loss of vegetation overstories, both which are necessary to mitigate runoff amounts and the associated soil transport. Now, this is a colleague's research of relating population growth to land conversion and increased impervious surface. You will note there's over a 400% increase in impervious surface for each incremental increase in population growth. Now, the major impacts of such development are twofold. The increased runoff and with volume of water passing down the watershed, and the increased rate of infiltration into the groundwater. With development, you'll see greater water coming down on the surface and less water infiltrating into the groundwater. Now, this is a hydrograph, the loss of infiltration capacity due to impervious surface, and related natural attributes such as vegetation, wetlands, etc., which, as I said, slows water flow here. Now, this will also have a direct impact on the seasonal flow of water levels in streams and rivers. Now, the seasonal low flow is really driven by groundwater that has fallen on the watershed 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago, and at the most upper layers of the system of soils currently 1 year ago. Infiltration-mediated low flow combined with increased frequency and duration of droughts will significantly reduce the level of low flows of streams and rivers on the Connecticut watershed. Correspondingly, there will be an increase in temperature and a decreased water oxygen level, which can significantly limit the range of cold water species. Now, based on historical data, expect extreme precipitation to increase about 70%. And the frequency of extreme floods up to 150%. Now, any removal of natural mechanisms or human-built infrastructure that can delay the flow of watershed will only increase the impact of natural systems and communities downstream. So maintaining the synchrony is key. Now, Staci will talk about something called Lane's balance. We'll basically deal with the dynamics of the moving water and the power of water and associated projection of water floods, as well as significant landscape and geomorphic settings as a result of the power and the erosion potential of that water. Basically, what was the streams of the past as far as their look on the watershed will not be the same, as much as we like to try to stop what's happening. Now, we will see a growing tension between some practices of extending both aquatic organism passage and recreational use and the need to mitigate flood impacts. Now, the watershed's loss of infiltration capacity and the natural mechanisms that reduce the power of stormwater runoff will increase at an increasing rate due to the projected climate and mediated population shifts. The diminishment of water infiltration combined with increased frequency and duration of droughts will increase substantially the seasonal stream low flows. So identifying and protecting cold water species refuges will become as vitally important over the time as aquatic organism passage efforts. So I think I'll stop there, stop my share, and pass it on to Staci.
Staci, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, here, let me get my screen. All right, you folks see the slideshow? I can't see you, so I'm hoping you see the screen.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for giving me a heads up. So I'll kind of continue to build on what Michael has set us up for, kind of looking at that larger consideration in the Connecticut River and climate change. And I'll narrow us down a little bit into looking at the rivers and flooding considerations. So I think it's helpful for us to start with a few definitions. So 3 primary types of streams that we look at are perennial, those that flow year-round typically; intermittent, those that may flow most of the year or more seasonally; and then ephemeral, those that generally exist for short periods of time during rainy events or snow melt events. But what's really important for us all to think about is that regardless of how frequently they have flow in them, all stream types transport water, sediment, and debris. So they're functionally moving material through the landscape. It's also important to recognize that stream process happens in all stream types. So that ephemeral stream may be dry part of the year, but when water is running in it, all those stream physics and adjustments are happening. It's also important to recognize that all stream types experience flooding. And so something that may look very small today, if we get a really heavy event, will flood or act differently. So it's important for us to have those basic kind of concepts of streams and where they are in the landscape. Now, it really leads us to thinking about the considerations that there are different settings and different stream types. So many of you, as you take a drive along the Connecticut River or in your area, will notice streams that are in really steep, narrow valleys. They don't have a lot of room to move around, but they might have really big rocks, steps, and pools. Compared to those that are, down by I live near the Lake Champlain Basin, and we have really large flat valley floodplains. There are those along the Connecticut River too, where the river may be more meandering. It may have very small bed materials such as sand or small gravels. And so really where you are in the landscape will have different stream types, and those will function differently depending on the materials in the valley that they are in. It's also important for us to recognize that rivers are always in motion. And Michael really set us up for some of those concepts. So thinking about temporal, so the timing of flow, when is it coming into the river? How does it reach the river? Is it coming quickly, or is there things in the landscape that are helping slow that down? Lateral considerations, so rivers move back and forth across the valley if there's space. Longitudinal connectivity is that upstream to downstream. And our vertical connection is to the floodplain as well as to the aquifer. So rivers are really dynamic across the landscape in many ways, and it's important to recognize those connections. We'll look at those a little more. As Michael mentioned, I'm going to briefly touch on lanes balance, and this is really a consideration of looking at power is in balance with resistance. But a river is in dynamic equilibrium. It's moving back and forth across that balance of materials that it's working through. And changes in the water, how quickly it's coming to, the amount of sediment or debris, or things that we do to the bed and banks can tip those scales. When we tip the scales, we can see things like increased erosion or increases in resistance of filling in the channel. So our goal typically when we do work along rivers is to really make sure we're not tipping that scale any more than it is dynamically, naturally being tipped back and forth. Many of us are familiar with the concept of inundation flooding, and that's that vertical connection or part of that vertical connection. How much space does the river have to flood to dissipate the energy and sediment and things across the landscape? And how frequently does that floodplain get accessed? Many of us are familiar with the concepts of the National Flood Insurance Program's 100-year flood, 50-year flood, 10-year flood, and that's really statistics. So a 100-year flood has a 1% chance of happening in any year. It could happen multiple times in a year, but based on our past knowledge and history of how frequently that type of storm hit, we call it's a 1% chance of happening. And as Michael pointed out, our flows and things are changing. And so what used to be today a 100-year event, maybe in the future is considered more of a 50-year event. So it's changing in the landscape, and we're learning about that. The picture that I just showed is the Richmond Park and Ride. Those vehicles were inundated in our 2011 event. And that is over a 1/4 mile away from the Winooski River. There's also a rail bed in between it. There's also a major road. And so just picture 4+ feet of water across this great landscape, really helping dissipate some of that energy that's moving through the channel. These floodplains are really important for water storage, habitat, sediment, and nutrient attenuation in the landscape. And so we look to these floodplains as important resources. The lateral connection is erosion. Rivers need to dissipate some of their energy, some more dynamically than others. And so during flooding events, most of the time people are focused on inundation, but it's also important to think about their erosion considerations. Because a stable river does not mean it's a static river. And we can really learn about that through looking at historic topos and different imagery resources. So if you look at the 1940s topo compared to the current topo, which was sometime in the 90s based on the imagery, you can see that there's some differences in the meander shapes, there's some cutoffs, there's a new oxbow. And then when you look at the 1996 imagery compared to that in 2019, you can see there's more oxbows, some more cutting off of the meanders, and some changes in where we have bars. So it's easy for us to think a river should always look the same as it did today, as it does tomorrow, but a river is always changing. As I mentioned, rivers move water, sediment, and debris, or large wood, and it's really important for a river system to have that because it provides resistance. So it helps slow water down as it's moving through the landscape. It provides that kind of rough factor that will dissipate the energy. It provides important habitat features. It also stores nutrients in the consideration. It provides a lot of very important benefits to the system, but it's oftentimes when we think about our rivers, we're just thinking about the water. And in particular, when we think about flooding, we're just thinking about the water. But rivers are always moving this important sediment and wood. That's an important component of the system. Michael mentioned, culverts playing an important role in how things are moving through the system. So that longitudinal connection, that how things are moving from upstream to downstream, how well are we? Or do we have things that are kind of blocking that system and can really supercharge an area? So if the culvert gets plugged, that's a lot of extra water, sediment, and material getting stored up behind it until the culvert fails and then it releases it quickly downstream. Our goal is really to make sure there's an even flow from upstream to downstream of those materials that help that river stay more in that dynamic balance. It's really important for us to think about where we are along the river system and in the watershed. It will affect the type of flooding that we see and then different types of stream processes that we might expect. So something down in the wide valley may be more likely to move laterally back and forth. It has the space to do that. Those upper watersheds, those narrow valley confined, might have a lot more power and be moving big material during a flooding event. So thinking about where we are in the landscape also helps us think about the types of management strategies that we may utilize, restoration considerations, and long-term resiliency planning efforts. I hear this a lot in my job. We just like the flooding to stop, and we don't want the river to adjust. It should look today the same way it did yesterday, and if we could just keep the water off the landscape, it would be better. But that's probably not really realistic. Rivers are meant to flood. That's why we have floodplains, and they're meant to move over time. That's why we can see those things. But when we have things, our own landscape features in our work, whether it be farming, whether it be the development, and we're impacted by those river adjustments or flooding, the desire from society is to make them stop. How have we done this? Well, historically and currently, we have a large part of our systems that are actively managed through straightening. If you would like a good read, DuPont's Farmer's Guide to Dynamite can also help you figure out how to get rid of that crooked stream. We've been digging them and moving them around to make our own needs to try to reduce those flooding or adjustments and utilize the landscape around us. Oftentimes after flooding, we hear a lot of, please dredge, please berm. We want to, make the river deeper. We want to protect things and move things around. These things have effects. They may not always provide the type of benefits that we would like. And I'm going to walk through a couple examples. So this is a simple drawing, a consideration for berming and what impacts it may or may not have. So scenario one, if we consider that the floodplain is accessible on both sides, when the water comes up, it spreads itself out, it dissipates its energy across the landscape. In scenario two, we've built up a berm on one side. Maybe we'd like to do some housing development on that area and we don't want it to flood anymore. Well, what happens to the water that used to go out across the landscape? Well, it's redirected back into the channel. So The water will hold more in the channel, and it's also directing more flow to the other floodplain if that's accessible. So it moves the water from one area to another. And how does that affect that other area? Does it put more power in the channel, making the channel more responsive and active? If we look at the last scenario where we've blocked off both floodplains, that really means now that we're holding a lot more of that power and energy. That water that used to dissipate itself across the floodplain is now being asked to hold in the channel. So we might protect one area, but that means that the downstream area is now going to have much more water and much more power in the channel when it arrives at those downstream locations. So we really need to make sure that we're thinking about the river as a connected system, and what we do in one location can impact other locations that we're not mindful of. So it's really important to think about those. I'm sorry, this feels like a very complicated picture and I didn't really be mindful of it. So I'll just kind of provide some high level considerations for dredging. One of the main points we often hear is if we could just make it deeper, if you could remove that gravel bar, we wouldn't have seen the flooding that we did in this location. Dredging and berming are tools in our toolbox, and there are locations that we must use them because we're trying to protect specific infrastructure. We're already kind of committed to managing it in those areas. But one of the considerations for dredging is when we dig a hole in the sediment of the river wants to respond. It wants to fill that hole back in unless dynamically the river is able to maintain that on its own. So what oftentimes happens is we dig an area out. It means that now we have this location where we've got an increase in depth, which can increase the power in the channel, which increases the erosion. And that starts a chain reaction. So we increase the material being pulled from upstream as the river now has a bit more of a steeper slope. That starts filling in the hole that we just tried to make. And then it also ends up creating additional sediment and erosion downstream. So when we think about dredging as a tool, it will only have a limited benefit for trying to remove water off the landscape, and it oftentimes will trigger other responses in the channel that may impact upstream or downstream of our site. So again, there's a tool in our toolbox, but it won't stop all flooding everywhere or have the full benefits that folks might think it does. And many of us are very familiar with bank stabilization. So historically, we've done a lot of traditional rock armoring, really trying to stop that. We've now been looking at also things like bioengineering, where we use more vegetation. And we've also seen places where we have a combined practice of stabilization with rock and then vegetation on top. And again, in this instance, we're trying to stop the channel adjustment, but it may transition to somebody else downstream or upstream or across from us that will then experience that channel adjustment. We need to continue to think of ourselves as a connected system. What happens when we do work on one area? How does that trigger something on the other area? How do we tip that balance? Are we tipping it so that it's really moving from one side to another at our local place that we were working on? Or is that transitioning to somebody else downstream? Collaborative considerations is important. So let's try something new, right? Historic factors, we're going to still use those tools, but we have some other ways of considering how we might look at flooding and river adjustments. Floodplain reconnection. Michael really showed how having those floodplains throughout the watershed, having the dissipation of energy over time can really reduce our impacts. So we have looked at different areas of floodplain connections. This happens to be a berm removal, the old rail bed that had significant impacts across our watershed. In this instance, this example, we reconnected about 36 acres of the floodplain. So that meant the community downstream had less water coming to it. The channel had less power in it. It means there was less damage when we had flooding in those areas downstream. So floodplain reconnection and berm removals are important strategies. We also look at barrier removal. So this is a picture of a dam removal that's happening. And then on the right is our example of a culvert that is flagged for replacement. You can really see how it's undersized, it's perched, so that aquatic organism passage consideration that Michael brought up is a barrier for that. If replacing it opens that back up and helps us reduce the flood damage. The derelict dams that we have in our watersheds, again, hold up a lot of sediment and materials behind them, in some instances increasing flood risk, but they also prevent the aquatic organisms moving upstream through the system. So these are great strategies that we've looked at for flood resiliency and water quality. In many instances in the past, we took wood out. We were trying to clear a path, make things flow quicker. And really what we've seen is in our headwater systems, we have gone back and been adding wood in strategically. This helps store that flow and sediment higher in the watershed, dissipate more energy, and as Michael said, kind of spread things out a bit more through the watershed to make it less dramatic when it gets down to the confluence area. And of course, many of you probably are very familiar with riparian plantings. These provide good roughness in the floodplains, so helping kind of slow water when it gets out across the floodplain. Really important habitat as it gets bigger. It provides important shading, a mix of corridors for animals to move along the river system, really reconnecting those areas. But it takes a long time for trees to grow. So, plant a tree today so that in 50 years, it's a healthy riparian watershed. It's not always easy for us to see those gains, but we can really appreciate the work that's put into those riparian planting projects. And in Vermont, we have what's called our river corridor and wetland corridor easement projects. And this is really an opportunity for the state and partners to purchase the channel management rights from a landowner. And this allows us to have in perpetuity a location in the watershed where we can have flooding and channel adjustments that allow for nutrient sediment attenuation, flood water attenuation, and channel adjustments to reduce the impacts to those landowners. And so this provides us a long-term 50-foot riparian area as well, important wetland protection areas, as well as the consideration for channel adjustment process. And in Vermont, what does that mean for the landowner? We look for incentive payments. So really finding that way to increase the opportunity for channel process to happen with decreasing the conflicts of the landowner with those process through an incentive process. And we can do these projects in urban floodplains as well as agricultural lands. So kind of the picture on the left is the community of Jeffersonville, and we protected a 5-acre urban floodplain that they saw was proposed for development. And in 2011, it was significantly flooded. The community realized that if it was developed, that flood water would go to other parts of the community. So they worked hard to protect that floodplain. The agricultural lands, oftentimes river adjustment doesn't always go well with ag practices, and it was very expensive to hard armor the entire river bank. The resources that were provided to the landowner allowed them to purchase fields and other areas to use. So we have that opportunity to kind of help step away from the river or the floodplain and those pressures. And just kind of to leave you with that success story. So this is Jeffersonville. Many of you may be familiar with Smuggler's Notch. So this is at the base of Smuggler's Notch ski area, that mountain. And what I really want to demonstrate here too is that no one project is going to fix our flooding or considerations at a site. So the community of Jeffersonville has been working since 2011 to implement many different strategies, protecting a corridor, changing an undersized bridge on the trail, elevating some historic homes, implementing stormwater practices, identifying a really undersized culvert under Route 15 that they were able to upsize to provide a bypass, working towards protecting the area that was proposed for development. And again, some additional work with Fish and Wildlife on their stormwater treatment and access points. So really kind of an opportunity for the community to look at not just one practice, but recognizing multiple practices that can help reduce those considerations of flooding. There's still going to be flooding. They are still in a floodplain, but they've reduced some of the heights by providing that open space. They've also kind of reduced some of the concerns with like raising a historic home that was important in the community. So many strategies to be looked at. These can be things, challenging things to understand. I really liked this picture of Einstein. Not everything that can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Lots of things for us to figure out. So what I have done here in the last few slides is just providing some resources. So folks might find Living in Harmony with Streams a great way to learn more about stream process. The Rivers program has some great resources available to folks. We also do a river and roads training that is available for folks of interest. Folks may be interested in some agricultural resources, so there was some information put together that folks could reach out to if they're in the ag community. I showed you many good map images and resources. So USGS Topo has some great historic images. VCGI has 1962 aerial images now. Google Earth has back into the 90s, so that can be really helpful. And our A&R Atlas also has some great resources for map imagery and data. And then for those of you who are in Vermont, getting to know your floodplain manager, river scientists, and river engineers, we're all technical folks that can help with kind of those considerations and questions. And then if you have any information or questions, you can certainly reach out to me in my contact. So I will stop sharing and I will turn it over to Becky.
Hey everybody, I'm Becky, CRC's Restoration Program Manager. You can go to the next slide. I'll just briefly share a little bit about the types of work that we do here at CRC. Just to highlight a couple things, we planted over 97,000 trees since 2011 and removed 24 dams since 2014, upgraded and removed 6 culverts, which restored 427 miles of river habitat. I'll let Lauren talk about the biostabilization and strategic wood additions in a few minutes. As Michael and Staci described, these projects improve resilience to climate change in multiple ways for wildlife and people. Next slide. I'll start with floodplain restoration. This slide shows a project in Plymouth, Vermont, where we removed a berm. The construction was completed last year. In this steep, narrow valley, one of the types of valleys Staci was talking about, Tropical Storm Irene washed away 2 homes and 1 town bridge along Penny Hollow Brook. The floodplain restoration included removing a berm and planting trees at the site so that future high flows can spread out and slow down. The increase in flood storage capacity during storm events reduces potential damage to infrastructure, helps limit sedimentation of aquatic habitat, and improves natural river functions. Next slide.
Hey, Becky, can you speak
Yes.
up just a little bit more? I'm getting a lot of comments that you are quiet right now.
I
Thank
wonder
you.
if I can set it up, turn it up.
That sounds better. I think just
Okay.
being a little closer. Thank
I'll
you.
get closer to the mic. Sorry, folks. Moving on to my favorite topic, dam removal. There are over 3,000 dams in the Connecticut River watershed. Many are old mill dams that are no longer used for their intended purpose or in poor condition. At the same time, due to climate change, as we'd heard earlier, storms are becoming larger and more powerful, which increases the risk of dam failure. On this slide, you can see pictures of the Dudleyville Dam in May 2024. During a large storm, the water level in the impoundment rose, which was exacerbated by the presence of an old beaver dam and threatened to undermine the old dam on the outside of the training wall. Its failure would have sent water and debris downstream, damaging roads and homes. Next slide. This is before and after. Just to orient you, those red arrows are pointing to the same rock in the scene. Removing an old dam like this improves climate resilience for communities by eliminating the risk of failure, and that would have potentially endangered people and required costly repairs. Next slide. In addition to the 3,000 dams, there are an estimated 44,000 stream crossings, both bridges and culverts, and many are undersized, preventing fish and aquatic organism passage. These are pictures of the culvert on Beaver Brook, which was immediately downstream of the Beaver Brook Dam in Wilmington, Vermont, during and after Tropical Storm Irene. The existing culvert was too small to accommodate the high flows, and the road was destroyed. Next slide. They repaired the crossing as shown here, but it was still undersized and restricted fish passage in this cold water trout stream. In 2023, the dam was removed and the culvert was replaced with that bridge that you can see, which can accommodate a 100-year storm. In addition to the community benefits of preventing costly damage and maintaining access to essential services, this helps wildlife by cooling stream temperatures and increasing accessible habitat. Healthy river systems and fish populations are more resilient to other types of disturbances. Next slide. And last, I'll finish with our riparian buffer plantings. Buffer projects can be a standalone project or part of another project. This is the planting day at Beaver Brook during the spring after we removed the dam and replaced the culvert. We planted about 450 native trees and shrubs in the riparian area that used to be underwater. Trees and shrubs contribute to a more resilient system. They help control erosion with their root systems, take up nutrients, store carbon, slow the flow of water during flood events, and provide habitat for wildlife. I like to call these the bountiful benefits of buffers. We love planting buffers at CRC and are on track to plant our 100,000th tree in 2025. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Great, thanks, Becky. So I'll just chat quickly about our biostabilization projects. So these are, you can see some of the photos here, are when we just have kind of bank erosion that's out of control. And why is this happening? Like Staci was saying, our rivers are out of equilibrium. So there are reasons, that Michael also highlighted about we're altering our watersheds, we're altering our hydrographs, climate change, everything is kind of coalescing into a situation where we're having bigger, wetter storms and higher, bigger floods and flows. And so what does that do? That puts a lot of stress on our riverbanks, especially if they have been incised a little bit, like the depth has increased. That means that all of that stress is that water is causing erosion to the banks. And so why do we want to fix these banks? First of all, it will take a very, very long time for them to equilibrate on their own. Could be hundreds of years depending on the process. And then on these riverbanks or nearby, we have infrastructure sometimes, or it's a public safety concern, or farms and people's livelihoods that we're trying to protect. And then aside from that, having all this sand or soil or gravel going into the river is causing water quality impacts. So not only is that sediment kind of impacting the bed and any habitat for our aquatic species, but also it contains nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, and that can kind of impact invasive species growth and algal growth downstream. So the goal of these projects is to find a way to use natural materials to kind of stabilize the banks and return it to a natural kind of erosion deposition cycle. Oops, wrong direction. Here we go. So one project I wanted to highlight is on the Emeritus River in Lisbon, New Hampshire. There's kind of a couple 100 feet of erosion happening along the bank here. And on the right side is a close-up of what that eroded bank looks like. So you can see the water sort of undercutting the soil. This is an old farm field, so it had grass or hay for a long time, and those roots are not very deep. And so the water is undercutting and eroding the soil, and it's just, there's no way that it's ever going to come back to natural in our lifetime. And then there's some roads and infrastructure that they were also concerned about. And so what we did, CRC worked with the Emeritus Conservation Trust and some local engineers to install this biostabilization project. So first what we did is we added some root wads. So these are trees where we have the root ball intact, and we kind of install them in the riverbank with the root ball sticking out into the river. And so what that does is it reduces the forces of the water flowing downstream, because now it has to kind of weave in and out of these root systems. It provides short-term stabilization, so 30, 40 years of protection, but eventually these trees will rot and then kind of move downstream. But it also provides great habitat for fish. We kind of call it like a little fish hotel because it provides slow flow and protection from predators. And so what else we did is we kind of lowered the elevation of that land, and so we created a little flood shelf, flood bench. You can see it kind of goes uphill a little bit and returns to that high, like where the normal elevation of that field. And so now the river has more room to kind of expand at these higher flood flows. So it's flooding here instead of downstream, and it's slowing down here and reducing that erosive potential. And then on top of that, we plant our plants. We plant our riparian buffer. And so this is what we consider the long-term stabilization in these style projects, because these water-loving plants and trees have really deep roots. And so those roots are gonna keep that soil in place, and it's gonna provide long-term stability, hundreds of years, as long as these buffers stay healthy and are continue to grow. And so this is the before picture. This is the after construction photo. So that was May. And this is December 2022. So you can see some of our erosion control grasses have started to grow. These are the root wads. And then on this aerial photo, you can even see where that floodplain bench is, and then that row of initial riparian species that were planted. And then if we go a couple of years later, now we're in July 2024, and you can see that this buffer has really grown in, and it will continue to do so kind of on its own. That's kind of the other goal of these style projects is, you know, we do the work, but we're really using natural processes so that they're self-sustaining practices. And then we have 3 of these projects planned for 2025, which is very exciting, and a couple more in future years. So it is something that CRC is focusing on. Quickly, I'll talk about strategic wood additions. So this is where, like Staci was saying, we're just adding wood back into these headwater streams. It kind of mimics some of these ecosystem services from when beavers would do this naturally. It adds complexity, it increases oxygen and decreases temperatures, which are all things that fish love. And so this really helps to boost our brook trout populations. So if root wads are fish hotels, these are like all-inclusive resorts for our brook trout. And it's we usually work with some local partners, and they're specialized in this style of work. So they'll take local trees, they'll cut them down, but you know, they're staying in the system and they're providing all these benefits. And it's a pretty rigorous approach. So there's a lot of data collection and science that goes into it. And we're seeing a lot of success with these style of projects. So CRC, we have restored 17 miles of river and 50 different streams within the whole watershed. So it is something that we will continue to work with our partners to implement. And that is everything from me.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for giving us all this great information to chew on and think about as we step forward. I am seeing that it's 12:59 and we promised a Q&A, and all of our speakers have so kindly said that they would stay on for a little bit of a longer webinar. So we'll do a few more minutes. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. But if you do need to go, we totally understand. We'll send out an email with follow-up resources after. So let me come all the way up here. We had a question from Bruce. Please comment on the role of culverts and their replacement / enhancement. I think Becky kind of talked about that. I just wanted to check in with Bruce if he's still on the line, if you needed any more clarity around that. And you can unmute if you'd like to, Bruce. Oh, you're still muted. We can see you though.
That was a good start. I'll go back and look at the slides and dig in deeper. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. All right, now.
I can add something for Bruce. Bruce, our research has done 3 major culvert studies in two of them in the Connecticut River watershed, the Ashwellet River and the Sugar River. And we also did one for the Oyster River, basically analyzing the impacts of and cost of undersized culverts, as well as the sizes they'd have to be to meet our projections for the future, which is a 750-year flood, not the 50 or 100-year flood.
I'll reach out and get those studies. Just FYI, the Fort River Watershed Association and the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission put in a grant to study the 1,000 culverts in the Fort River watershed and put all the data in the NAC, the North Atlantic Connectivity System. Anyway, I don't remember the whole name of it.
Thanks so much, Bruce. I appreciate your question. Thanks, Michael. Moving forward, William asked, in narrow stream channels, would it be a good idea to build roads on a bridge elevated above the appropriate flood levels, allowing the stream to meander beneath the road on the bridge? This is instead of armoring the stream banks to keep the road from being washed away during floods. Staci, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to take this one?
Sure, that's a good question. Yeah, that can be a good tactic to be able to elevate your road system above where your floodplain area is expected to be. Both in narrow and in wider valleys, it can be more challenging in a wider valley because frequently in a wider valley, we end up filling to try to elevate the road or the bridge above that area. But it can be a strategy to help reduce impacts by kind of lifting our infrastructure up and out of those expected floodplain areas.
Great. Any other folks have anything to add before we go to the next question? All right. Let's see. So Lauren from VRC, thanks VRC for attending. This is directed to you, Lauren, and it's a juicy question. Where does funding come from to implement the biostabilization projects? And then to echo this, Juliana G also asked, how do you afford to create and implement these flooding solutions? So.
It's a great question. There are different federal and state kind of buckets of money depending on where you live and what your issues are. There is a lot of money for AOP projects, aquatic organism passages. So that's like dam removals and culvert replacements. That's kind of one set of funding. Biostabilization can sometimes be a little more of a challenge. We've often found our funds from NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They have practices specifically set aside for these style of biostabilization projects. The Long Island Sound Futures Fund, which is a NIFWF, National Fish and Wildlife Federation fund, that focuses on water quality in Long Island Sound, but where do those nutrients come? They come from soil erosion up in the upper watershed. So that's another source of funds that we've used. I work in New Hampshire. My projects are New Hampshire focused. So we also look at like wetland mitigation funds and moose plate funds, for example. And I know Vermont and Massachusetts and Connecticut have their own suite of funds at the state level. So I would say that's majority of my funds are NRCS, Long Island Sound Futures Fund, and then local New Hampshire efforts.
Might I just add, this is Rebecca Todd of the Connecticut River Conservancy. We've seen some significant shifting in our funding recently. The new administration has frozen about $13 million worth of CRC's funding to implement exactly the kinds of projects that we've been talking about today. So we are actively trying to thaw those frozen funds because, as you can see, the benefits of these projects accrue to private landowners and everyone downstream of them. So keep your fingers crossed for us.
Rebecca, I think you read Noah's mind. We just got a question in that said, will the federal funding cuts affect the CRC project? So I don't know if you want to elaborate on what you did. Hey, Noah.
Yeah, will and have. So Lauren has a really ambitious and wonderful grant from NRCS to implement about $11.5 million worth of really important projects in New Hampshire. And that's the largest one of our grants that's been frozen. We are hopeful, but we are waiting. So as many of our colleagues in the nonprofit world are as well, I'll rush to add.
A follow-up to that question, what is being done to thaw those funds from the CRC side of things? Just curious, by Jill. Not sure.
So
Yeah.
we've reached out to the entire federal delegation in the Connecticut River Watershed to alert them to the plight. We've informed them of the environmental importance of these projects, and also highlighted that it makes good economic sense that most of this funding does not come to CRC, but it's pass-throughs to local contractors who are installing the root wads, for example, for us, to engineers who are designing the projects, and the benefit goes to private landowners. So we believe that there's a positive environmental message as well as a really positive local economic message that we can deliver. And if anybody has any other help or ideas for us, we're all ears.
Thanks, Rebecca. VRC said, good luck, Rebecca and CRC crew. Please let VRC know if we can do anything to help. So thank you. And I'm seeing a few folks standing at the AP Environmental Science computer. Maybe there's more questions. I just want to double check before we wrap up. You're all set? Great. Thanks, Noah. All right, folks, thank you so much for attending and joining us today for this live stream event to learn more about your watershed.